Has anyone ever coached or been coached? The same kind of logic would be there's kids who you coach or who you've been coached who all you have to do is tell them very calmly. Another kid, the coach might have to scream at them. Another kid, the coach might have to give them the silent treatment. Basically, coaches throughout Western history have known that kids vary on temperamental constructs and that different approaches, stern with one, silent with one, yelling with another, using profanity with another, will produce the same positive outcome. But you got to know which style to use with which kid. Okay, and that's really what temperament brings in neuropsychiatry, psychiatric deficits relating to self-control brings to the prevention literature, is understanding what these kids are like and understanding that these are largely irritable things that we can maybe manipulate. This paper came about because, in addition to everything else, I'm a huge true crime buff. And so, why is it that we have most of the research or the writing on sexual homicide offenders is coming from journalists and authors? And why has criminology not explored it more than they have? And so what we tried to do with this case is to use a very popular mainstream criminological theory and also talk about conceptually sexual homicide offending and how it sort of represents a paradox of sorts to Gottfredson and Hershey's work. Okay, and so this is a chapter coming out in the book maybe this year. Many of you are probably familiar with the FBI typology of sexual homicide offending. Briefly, you always hear about serial killers. They're bad, but really what they are sexual homicide offenders. They abduct and sexually aggress and murder people. They marry the sexual aggression in the homicide event, and they're precisely the ones who usually do that repeatedly over time. And I'm going to kind of give it away here. How can you do that and plan that over time, years or decades? Does that suggest to you right off the top of your head someone who has no control or someone who has extraordinary control? Bressler and Burgess and Douglas created a two-part typology that was really quite nice, based upon the murder scenes that they had investigated. On one hand, you had the disorganized sexual murderer. That person, the offense appeared to be spontaneous. The victim was known to them, but it was depersonalized during the process or during the crime. They engaged in minimal conversation during the attack. The murder scene appeared random and sloppy. It was characterized by sudden violence with minimal use of restraints, sort of like a blitz attack. There were sexual acts after murder. And the victim's body was often left in plain view, and importantly, weapons and other forensic evidence were often left present at the scene. So this appeared to be something that was really quite spontaneous and sort of a blitz, unplanned thing. If you ever watched the show Criminal Minds, one of the first things they do when they respond to a homicide is sort of think of this typology. Does this murder scene reflect disorder, or does it reflect order, or disorganization, or organization? The other type is organized sexual homicide offending, where the murder was planned and the targeted stranger was personalized. The person was very purposely selected. There was controlled conversation during the killing, the use of restraints, aggression before death, and a demand of the victim of submission. The entire crime scene of the organized killer reflected control. The victim's body was hidden or transported, and there was absence of weapons or other forensic evidence to basically make sure that the person would get away with it. Okay, so on one hand, you have in the FBI typology this organized sexual homicide and organized sexual homicide, and what John and I thought was you could really superimpose self-control onto that. With disorganized sexual homiciders, offenders really consistent with a mobile street offender. Impulsive, spontaneous, not well thought out, poorly controlled. But then when you go over this way, Everything about the crime scene or the murder scene reflects extraordinary control. What we suggest in this chapter is that you can really, two things. One is we should start trying to use mainstream criminological theories to understand what have really now been journalistic or forensic topics or subject matter. There's really no reason why there should be separate journals and separate groups of researchers studying sexual homicide. If theories are good and they're valid and they're general, they should explain all types of offending. Okay, so I think we need to have more creativity with trying to utilize extant criminological theory to explain the extreme of offending. And there is some interesting research out there taking social learning theory, for example, and how do life experiences in the military, for example, sort of prospectively predict homicide later. If you think about the disorganized sexual homicide offender, it's really the average street offender. Not really bright, really quite sloppy, instantaneous impulse that is can't be denied, and then once it's done, you get out of there. Converse, the word that comes to mind is, and it's another scientific one, is it's quite sloppy. Okay, the murder's unplanned, it's hasty, and it's really poorly contemplated. In contrast, everything about the organized sexual homicide offender exudes self-control. And to go back to the sort of cooling off periods that characterize serial murder, if you think about the psychopathology that's needed to be a sexual homicide offender, and then think, how can a person engage in that and then plan for months or years or decades and spread out additional acts like that? There are crime scenes evince very high self-control, particularly relating to the awareness of the things or the clues or the evidence that's going to get them caught. People like Eric Beauregard and Patrick Roussier are doing some interesting research where they're using sort of some of these chronological predictors of this forensic awareness that's going on at homicide or sexual assault scenes. Planning is not the strong suit of offenders with low self-control, but paradoxically, planning is the strong suit of a sexual homicide offender. Okay? Planning, premeditation, and we think self-control. There's another thing, or at least two other things we think might be going on. Could it be the case that everything I've just said is true? Or could it be the case that there are other constructs or other conditions that sexual homicide offenders have that contribute to their behavior? And the two that primarily come to mind are, one is primary psychopathy, which is really the chilling, conscienceless psychopath. Okay, the one you like to read about. Okay, is that really what's driving this behavior that seems to suggest such high self-control? Therefore, is it psychopathy or is it self-control? Another important construct is sexual sadism. Is it the case, and especially when these two are both found in the same offender, and they often are, is it the case that it's self-control that's going on with this disorganized, organized sexual homicide thing, or are these other constructs basically trumping the power of self-control? Empirically, got to work that out, but where we wonder, is it enough to just say, there's this interesting paradox at the high end of psychopathology, and some of them have really high self-control. Or is that idea spurious because other things are going on? For the purposes of theory building, and this is sort of a larger issue in criminology, is for many years criminology had a sort of limitation in that it focused on community samples and really low-level benign offenders. And the reason it did that is it thought that severe offenders were somehow different. And increasingly, and across a number of fields, especially with Moffat's work, especially with some of the careers people who are studying sexual homicide offenders, sexual offending and homicide offending, you're getting more of a sort of synergy between mainstream crim and these more extreme offenders. Another way to think about it would be this. Without question, sexual homicide offenders usually, and psychopaths, for example, are usually not very bright. There's a strong inverse relationship between intelligence and violence. But yet you have cases of people like Ted Bundy who are highly intelligent. But it doesn't impugn the larger relationship between cognition and aggression, or cognition and crime. Let me give you another example. Are girls smarter than boys, or are boys smarter than girls? Girls are smarter than boys, okay, generally. But when you go out to the extremes, the tails of that distribution, what you find is that boys are overrepresented by a factor of 3 or 4 or 5. So what that means is that when you start going 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 standard deviations above the mean of intelligence, it's going to be disproportionately male. And when you go in the other direction, below the mean of intelligence, it's going to be disproportionately male. In other words, the general relationship between intelligence and sex or gender is that females are advantaged. But at the extremes, they're not as present. And so what does that mean in terms of society? Well, if you look at evidence on mental retardation or pervasive developmental disorders, you see that there's a huge sex ratio there of males to females. If you look at things like the eminence literature, you see the same thing. Thinking about intelligence and thinking about these distributions, I think, is helpful to get you thinking about how does the self-control relationship really work, and do interesting things go on when you start going out to the extremes. Okay. This is just what I just said. For graduate students, if there are any in here, what you don't want to do is extrapolate from this sort of paradoxical thing and take from that there isn't a relationship between self-regulation or self-control and violence, because there sure is. But what I'm wondering is if when you go out to those tails, if something else is going on. Okay, final one. We're good on time. Another little construct that I think is helpful, because it'll permeate this next paper, is to what degree does Goffredson and Hershey's notion of low self-control represent, or how well can we map that onto structural models of personality? And the facet of the 5-factor model that to me is the most interesting is conscientiousness. Okay. What's conscientiousness? Well, people who are very conscientious are very competent. They're have a very ordered lifestyle. They're tidy. They're fastidious. Some people would say they're anal. They're very dutiful. They are very achievement striving. They have very high self-discipline. And they are very deliberate and planned. Okay? Think about those words, those adjectives I just used, and then think about someone who obtains an MD or a PhD. It sure seems like conscientiousness would be associated with achievement striving is the one that I was thinking of. People who have high levels of educational attainment and often high income usually score highly on conscientiousness. Particularly, again, let's go out to those extremes. Conversely, if you have people who, don't look at this for a moment, people who are incompetent, disordered, sloppy, frivolous, feckless, underachievers, poorly controlled, and hasty. That sounds like really a different set of adjectives to describe low self-control. Okay? And so conscientiousness, the reason I talk about it is this last paper is on resilience. And what resilience is when you have pro-social outcomes when environmental risk factors would have suggested you had antisocial ones. why is it that some people who are in negative environments nevertheless don't manifest the negative condition? The way to think about this is the landmark study by Cassidy and Muffin that was in Science that looked at the interaction between MAOA and child maltreatment. And what they found was that if you had low activity allele of MAOA and you were abused, it predicted about 10 antisocial conditions. If you were maltreated or abused as a child and you had the high activity allele, you didn't manifest that. In other words, the low activity allele of MAOA is a genetic risk factor coupled with the environmental pathogen. The high activity allele is a genetic buffer. Okay? So what this paper looks at is of some of the genes that are in the ad health, are any of those polymorphisms associated with resilience? Okay? And really the way to think about it is when you do research on genetics, people often get hysterical, honestly. And they sort of impose these diabolical plans that you have for doing this research. What research on resilience does is just simply flips that. What we're trying to understand is, what is it about some kids that were exposed to some environmental pathogen or social pathogen and got out of it unscathed? How can we use genetic polymorphisms to understand good stuff? Because we also use it to understand bad stuff, and it works both ways. Earlier I had mentioned behavioral genetics studies. What those do is decompose variants. How much of intelligence, novelty seeking, et cetera, is attributable to genes, environment, and the other environment. What molecular genetic association studies do is take measured genetic polymorphisms and measured environmental factors and put them in the same study to see how a variant of a gene, how are those associated with things that are in turn associated with antisocial behavior, or in this case, resilience. In genetic speak, the ultimate outcomes are phenotypes. The middle range stuff are endophenotypes. So to annoyingly go back to Gofferdson and Hershey again, all of those characteristics of low self-control really are the endophenotypes, and lots of genetics factors work on those. And in turn, if you have high impulsivity, you're more likely to have low self-control. Okay, so it's sort of a more nuanced way to study these things rather than just saying we're going to take these genetic factors and try and predict the ultimate outcomes. We've done that too, but it's sort of more elegant to look at what are the middle range factors. These are candidate genes for lots of behavioral outcomes and for lots of temperamental and personality traits because they're involved in neurotransmission. Okay, and the 5 that are in the ad health and the original, they've released a few more, I think, nicotine genes. Dopamine genes are here. This is a transporter. These are receptors. This is the serotonin transporter, linked polymorphic region, and this is MAOA. So these 3 genes are in the dopaminergic system. This is in the serotonergic system, and this gene is called an enzymatic degrader. It's basically like a mop. So it sort of mops up other neurotransmitters in the brain. If you ever have known anyone who had anxiety or depression, there's lots of medications that are basically targeting the serotonergic system. What antidepressants do is try and modulate serotonin levels in the brain, because those serotonin levels are then in turn associated with mood. Okay? Criminal offenders, or antisocial people generally, are another thing to think about is the dopaminergic system is an approach or appetitive neurotransmitter. It's an excitatory one. Serotonin is an inhibitory one. So offenders usually have low serotonin levels. Neurotics, who we talked about a couple papers ago, have high serotonin. They have too much brake, too much restraint, too much inhibition. Offenders don't have enough. Okay, so I take some time on this overhead for 2 reasons. One, I'm trying to kill time. The second one is to get you thinking about how these ugly genes are really just simply a molecular measure of things we already know. Okay? Things we already know. Resilience, again, so this study is looking at what are genetic environmental predictors of kids who seem to turn out pretty good even though they have at risk for negative behaviors or delinquency. And really the takeaway point from this slide to think about is that genetic factors confer both protective and risk status, just like environmental factors do. Okay, so let me give you an example, and I'll be a personal one. I'm not a very neurotic person. Okay, I don't often manifest anxiety. That really helps you when you have to publicly speak. Because I've actually heard people at this conference say, not they weren't talking to me, but I heard them talking, they vomited before their presentation. Some of them vomited after their presentation. Okay? I'm very unlikely to vomit because of nerves. Okay? So again, we all have these genes. Okay, about 99% of the human population has the same genes. There are just some genes that are polymorphic. And what that means is those genes create proteins that create neural substrates or brain pathways that are more or less efficient. And some of that efficiency manifests in the person who has to throw up before they talk publicly because they're more neurotic, and the person who doesn't. Okay, so those genetic factors, on the one hand, the neurotic, that's not a good thing. And if you're a cool, calm customer, that's a good thing. Okay? Being reared in poverty is a bad environmental pathogen. It's an environmental pathogen. Being reared in very warm parental environments is a good thing. Where you see the problems in genetics research and crime is when you have the interaction of the genetic risk and the environmental risk. When both are bad, bad stuff happens. Okay, so this is looking at across 3 waves of data in the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. What's interesting to me, because it has a bigger and better track record, is this DRD4 gene, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But what you see are significant effects across waves, especially for DRD2. Okay, there's also some race and gender effects, but they're suggesting that variance in these genetic polymorphisms, and you can code them or measure them different ways. You can do it where it's basically the number of risk alleles you have. That's usually how Kevin does it. I think it's the best way. Those are associated with resilience over time. In terms of lifetime resilience and total victimization, we again see an effect for DRD2 and a opposite effect in the other direction for DAT1, and I'll talk about how these effects flip at times. Other than DRD4, all of the polymorphisms were associated with resilience, either cross-sectionally or longitudinally. That's interesting to me because DRD4 in 1996, a bunch of researchers in a special issue of Nature Genetics linked DRD4 with novelty seeking. So it was the first scientific evidence that variants in the DRD4 gene were associated with novelty seeking. What's novelty seeking? What's that?
Seeking out new, exciting stuff.
Exactly. Okay, and so what's the implications of that for crime?
You're talking about association with arousal?
It could be, but the way I'm thinking of it is think of conferences. People who are high in novelty seeking, to them, once you're done doing what you need to do, you go out and check out the city. Go out and have a few beers, go to a bar, go do this or that. People who don't have that novelty seeking or have another big one in the same work is called harm avoidance, what they do is they go back to the room and work. What I want you to think about is if you think of constructs like harm avoidance, novelty seeking, conscientiousness, what you just had are, and again, think of 2 people you know, one person who's got to go out and get in the mix. That's not in and of itself bad. But that person's going to have much more opportunity to get into trouble because they're going to be interacting with who knows who. The person who's squared away in the room working isn't going to get into trouble. Okay? And so if you think about those two kind of conference examples, how do you know when you go out, because you're high in novelty seeking, that you're not going to bump into someone who has all of those deficits I talked about in the first couple papers? And you're novelty seeking and having a beer and you kind of talking to your friends and you bump into the wrong person. Well, the person who's working away in the room isn't going to ever have to deal with that. Okay, so I want you to think about are how personality and temperament and all of those things ultimately unfold into behavior. And what our work and we're just following the lead of people like Moffitt and Cassidy. What this paradigm does is it allows you to understand things that we've always known, just at a fancier level. Okay? It allows you to understand them from a psychiatric or psychological perspective, from a neuroscience perspective, from a genetic perspective. I often get asked, well, what's the implications of your work? What policies will unfold from it? And I kind of have two answers. One is virtually never does anything that you will do as a criminologist find its way into the criminal justice system. Okay, so I was a criminal justice practitioner prior to being an academic, and I never utilized criminology research to do my job. And I did my job very effectively. So this notion that this research is going to then suddenly go into the NYPD is just simply not true. And the other thing is it's just clarifying what we've always known. Okay? If you're old like me, when the General Theory of Crime was published in 1990, it angered the establishment of criminology. And the reason that it angered is because it said, we can talk about neighborhoods, we can talk about stratification, we can talk about poverty, we can talk about family structure, we can talk about racism, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about all these things. But really what causes crime are individual level deficits that they called self-control. And everyone was outraged, and then look at how it's been received. And now you basically have to control for self-control if you're going to publish an article, because if they don't, the viewers are going to tell you, how do we know this is true? It's probably self-control. The same kind of thing has happened with the biosocial stuff. When we started this in 2005, there'd be 2 or 3 people in the audience. And we've had sessions that were just jammed. And just the amount of traffic that this area has gotten, and the amount of attention that it's received, I think it's only going to proliferate from here. And it should, because I want ACJS and ASC to, frankly, be more believable and viable. And I think that using constructs from allied fields is only going to make criminologists better and more respected. Okay. Any questions?